Hello, everybody. Welcome to this webinar from the Hope Border Institute. You're joining us here in El Paso. I'm coming to you here from our offices of Hope here in El Paso. My name is Dylan Corbett, and I'm the Executive Director of the Hope Border Institute. We're really excited that you've joined us. We've got folks from around the region. I want to say hi to our partners and from around the region and the area here in Ciudad Juarez, in El Paso, and southern New Mexico. And then I also want to welcome everyone who's joined us from around the country and around the world. This webinar today, we're going to be talking about the latest numbers from CBP. So CBP normally publishes numbers regarding the latest arrivals to the US-Mexico border, folks who have turned themselves in and folks who have been apprehended. So we want to take a little bit of a look at that. So what we'll do during the webinar is take a look at those numbers, do a little bit of a deep dive, talk a little bit about also some of the context and the causes that are motivating people to come to the border and what they're encountering here at the border in El Paso in particular. And then we'll talk a little bit as well about some opportunities that you have to get involved in the work and things that you can do on behalf of justice for migrants here at the border. So again, welcome very much, and we're glad to have you with us, and we're gonna take a deep dive in right now. At the end, we'll take some questions. So we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. We hope to go for about an hour until 1 o'clock Mountain Time. So I should finish up well in advance of that time so that we have plenty of time for your questions, and we'll take them via the Q&A tool here on the Zoom application. So once again, welcome, and we're gonna dive right in. Before we get into the data, before we get into some of the impacts of the policies that we've seen over the last couple months, here on the border communities and on migrants who are passing through our community. I do want to make reference to what happened here in El Paso back on August 3rd, which is you had essentially what was a massacre. There were 22 people who were killed, Latinos, from this community and from our sister community across the border in Ciudad Juarez, and you had 24 people who were also injured. Much of the media attention across the country, understandably, has moved on from this massacre. And some of the attention, the lingering attention, has gone, understandably and rightfully so, towards the imperative to work for gun control measures. And we need to do that. That's important work, that's critical work, and that's essential work. But there was something very unique about what happened here with the massacre of the 22 folks here in El Paso. El Paso was targeted for being El Paso. And someone from outside of our community came into our community and targeted Latinos for who they were. This was a massacre of Latinos that was deliberate, that was planned, and it was executed by somebody who came into this community from outside and did this on purpose and did it to send a message. Now, the reason I bring this up is because in this community, those who are engaged in these issues of immigrant justice, who are engaged in the fight for justice for migrants on the border, and who are pushing against the policies of criminalization of migrants and the militarization of our border communities, see that there are deep resonances and deep connections between what happened on August 3rd and what has happened over the past couple of years with ever harsher enforcement measures, with the dehumanization of migrants who are continuing to come to our border, with things like family separation, with things like zero tolerance, and some of the policies that we're going to be talking today. Our community over the past couple of years, when we've seen a spike in arrivals of families and of children and of unaccompanied minors who continue to come to our border seeking safety, seeking refuge, in a very unique way, El Paso has shown the rest of the country that we can respond to what is happening here on the border with generosity, with compassion, with humanity, and with respect for people's human rights. That there's another way to deal with what is happening on the border than what is coming out of Washington, D.C. right now. What's coming out of Washington, D.C. right now are policies that dehumanize. What's coming out of Washington, D.C. is one strategy, not to deal with the humanitarian crisis at the border, but rather to deter. There's simply one strategy, and that's deterrence at all costs of migrants who are coming to the border. And that deterrence has two faces: one of militarization, the militarization of border communities like El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, and of criminalization, throwing the pall, casting an ever greater pall over more and more immigrants and treating them more and more like criminals. And that includes legal asylum seekers. And that's what we're seeing. And that's driven not because there's any policy gap here on the border, not because there's nothing that we can do to respond to the increase in arrivals of folks here at the border seeking safety and seeking refuge. That's happening because there is a racially motivated, a xenophobically motivated, a fear-motivated political project that's coming out of Washington, D.C. And we have to push back against that. And there are deep connections between the El Paso massacre and what we've seen. There are people who are targeted because of the color of their skin. There are people who are targeted because of their cultural and racial identity. And there are people who are targeted because of their immigration status. And I want to start with that simply because we're here on the ground in El Paso are still wrestling with the implications of that. And so even though the media attention might fade away, even though folks might understandably lump what happened here in El Paso with the far too common instances of gun violence throughout our country, we're still dealing with the reverberations of what happened, and we see the connections with a movement of hate that continues to affect targeted communities here on the border and across the country. This is a picture of the spontaneous memorial that has gone up outside of the Walmart where the massacre happened. And this picture is very meaningful to me because you can see all the memories, the recuerdos that people have left outside to pray for, to remember, to honor those who died in their lives and those who were injured. But the lights that you see there in the background, off in the distance, those are the lights of Ciudad Juarez. And so this picture, I just find it's very meaningful because it points to the unity of our communities and to something that's very special, to something that was attacked and targeted back on August 3rd. And El Paso will continue to stand up. El Paso was attacked for its values. Was attacked because of that generosity and compassion and the fact that migration is part of our DNA. But we're not going to be intimidated by that. And we have to work to make sure to continue to demonstrate that there's another way to deal with what's happening here on the border, with mercy, with justice, and with compassion. So let's get into the numbers. On a regular basis, CBP publishes numbers. So this is all government, this is all data that's publicly available. It's provided by the US government and CBP. And it provides a bit of a snapshot into what exactly is happening on the border. You probably heard that over the past several months and over the past couple of years, there's been a notable increase in folks who are arriving to the US-Mexico border. And we've seen that in different parts of the border, and in a special way, in a unique way rather, here in El Paso, where the arrivals have gone up, have spiked quite dramatically. What we've seen over the past year and over the past several months is that there have been a series of measures coming from the Trump administration to try to stop that flow, to stem that flow. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what some of those measures are. You've heard about things like zero tolerance, you've heard about things like family separation, but now what we're seeing in particular in the last couple of months, several months rather, in 2019 is we're seeing new measures which are beginning to stem a little bit the flow. So what we might be seeing in this decrease, and I'll get into it in a second, is the effect of policies like Remain in Mexico, the effect of policies like cooperation and collaboration with the Mexican government to deploy the Mexican National Guard to their northern and southern border and throughout the country to stop migrants who are passing through Mexico, and other policies, which I'll also talk about, that help to account a little bit for the reduction that we're seeing. And that's really the big news about the graph that you have here in front of you. The red line indicates migrant arrivals to the US-Mexico border, folks who have been apprehended or turned themselves in between ports of entry, as well as folks who have turned themselves in at ports of entry. That red line represents 2019. And so the first thing you'll notice is that there's a significant increase in arrivals to the US-Mexico border in 2019. You go to the top line on the bottom of the graph, FY19, again, that red line, and you start to look at the numbers. The fiscal year that we're in right now, fiscal year 2019, started back in October of last year. So the numbers begin in October, and you can see how they progress through July, which is the last data that we have. In July, there were about 82,000 migrants who arrived to the US-Mexico border and who either turned themselves in or were apprehended in between ports of entry or turned themselves in at ports of entry. And so the first thing that you'll notice is that there's a bit of a drop between July and June. In total, if you compare June to July, there's been a 24% drop in apprehensions of folks at the border. In El Paso, we've seen that there's been an even more significant drop. It's about 39%. So you've probably seen in the news or on the television that the Trump administration has been talking about this as something that is a result of the policies that they've put in place, like Remain in Mexico and some of the other policies. Without a doubt, there's some truth to that. There are soldiers at the southern border with Guatemala, and there are also soldiers at our northern border. In Mexico's northern border, our border with Ciudad Juarez. If you were to come right now to Ciudad Juarez and travel the length of the border, you'd be able to see the deployment of troops every so many yards across the border. And their job is really to stop, interdict the flow of Central American migrants who are coming to the border to seek protection. And that includes asylum seekers. So that's very troubling to us. So between the deployment of the Mexican National Guard and the ramping up of what's known as Remain in Mexico, or the migrant protection protocols, that accounts certainly for some of the drop, that 24% drop that we're seeing. However, it has to be said too that some of that drop is accounted for in terms of something that happens seasonally. There's typically a drop in July as we approach the height of summer, the hot temperatures. There's a drop of migrants who are coming to the US-Mexico border that happens every year. And so that's happened for the last 9 or 10 years. And so that too also accounts for no doubt for some of that drop. We don't know what's going to continue to happen in August and September. If the numbers continued even at that level of 82,000 for 1 month, that is very significant. And that might bring us to a total for the fiscal year of 2019 of over 1 million arrivals to the US-Mexico border. That's still very significant, even if that drop continued and we're still approaching 1 million arrivals. That's something that we haven't seen since 2005, to give you a sense of the scale of what's happening. So it continues to be, we continue to see very large amounts of migrants who are coming to the US-Mexico border. Now, we can drill a little bit further down into the numbers if we take a look at this next slide. On the top half of the slide, you'll see Border Patrol's numbers. And on the bottom half of the slide, you'll see CBP, Customs and Border Protection, the folks who are manning the ports of entry. So folks generally know that Border Patrol, they're responsible for the application of immigration law in between ports of entry. And most migrants are going to come into contact with Border Patrol because they're crossing and they continue to cross in between ports of entry. Most of them, of course, will turn themselves in and ask for asylum. And then CBP, they're the folks who man the ports of entry. And so the folks who come to the ports of entry to present and seek asylum, that's that bottom row of numbers. And so we can see that we can look in greater detail at who is coming, the demographic that's coming. Most of the folks, of course, are coming into the custody of Border Patrol, so that's telling us that they're coming in between ports of entry. Now, why is that? We know why that is, because the policy of metering or asylum term packs means that folks who are received at the ports of entry are very, very few. If folks present at the ports of entry, they'll generally be turned back. That's why it's called the policy of turnbacks. It's a metering policy. So they're literally metering the amount of people who are allowed to turn themselves in, and they'll be told to get on a list. So there are a variety of lists at border communities, Ciudad Juarez, Tijuana, in the Rio Grande Valley, different cities where migrants literally have to get on a list and wait in line, wait on a turn in order to wait for asylum. And so that metering policy, what that effectively does is incentivize people to cross the border in between ports of entry, because some of them cannot wait. And so they're crossing in between ports of entry and being apprehended by Border Patrol. So if we pay attention then to the Border Patrol numbers, which are at the top of the slide, you'll see that we continue to see a very large amount of unaccompanied children who are coming to the border, nearly 6,000 in July, and also family units. Family units are coming to the border. The May numbers for family units were very high. They peaked in that month for this year at nearly 85,000. So we've got a significant drop in the month of July at almost 43,000. But still, these numbers are very high. And you can see how unaccompanied families are making up for the majority of folks who are coming into contact with Border Patrol. We're going to move on to the next slide now. And it allows us to drill even down further into some of the data that CBP has released. These are unaccompanied children who have been apprehended at different parts of the border. So we can see the geographic regions where they've been apprehended. And this compares where we are right now in the fiscal year in July to where we were last year about this time. We did have that spike over the past year, and so you see how significant that was. In El Paso, if you look at the El Paso sector, we had a nearly 250% increase in the arrivals of unaccompanied children to our border community. And in Del Rio, it was 178%. So very significant amount of arrivals in the past year of unaccompanied children who continue to come. Now, this shows us where the countries of origin of those unaccompanied children. And the first thing you'll see is that Guatemala is at the top of the list with nearly 29,000 children in fiscal year, where we are right now in terms of fiscal year 2019. So a significant number, followed by Honduras, and then El Salvador, and then Mexico. So significant numbers of unaccompanied children coming to the border in Guatemala in particular. And again, in the past year, in terms of comparing where we are in terms of the fiscal year right now to last year, look at El Paso. It's a 1,510% increase relative to the last year of family units that are coming to El Paso. So we're seeing lots of families. We're seeing lots of children. We've seen that in our community in terms of the folks who are being released, in terms of the folks who are trapped in Ciudad Juarez and border communities in Mexico by Remain in Mexico. We know this is the case. We see them every day, families and children, and the data, of course, is bearing this out. And then again, in Del Rio, in the Rio Grande Valley, over 1,000% increase in family units who are coming to the border. So very significant arrivals of family units. And then where are these families coming from? Similarly, we can dive into the data and tell. And once again, from Guatemala. Guatemala is the sending country for the top number of families who are coming to the border, followed by Honduras, then El Salvador, and then Mexico. So again, the Northern Triangle continues to be a significant sending country. So going back now, you can see the larger numbers, and again, family units and unaccompanied making up a big percentage of the folks who continue to arrive at the border. And again, if we continue, this is going to be a record year in terms of arrivals, despite all of the obstacles that the Trump administration has erected. So that tells you a lot. What is essentially happening is the Trump administration is throwing everything that they have at the wall in terms of these policies to stop migrants from coming. And so the fact that they continue to arrive to the US-Mexico border in the face of all these obstacles, in the face of all these restrictive policies and enforcement actions tells you something about the conditions that are driving these families, that they're willing to take the risk. And that's what we're seeing here. So what accounts for some of that drop, that 24% drop that we do see from this month, from July compared to June? Remain in Mexico, no doubt, is a big part of that. So I'll talk a little bit about what Remain in Mexico looks like here in this border community. Metering, we've talked about the turning back of asylum seekers at ports of entry, definitely another factor. The Mexican military is certainly a factor. They're visible and they're out in force here in El Paso and Ciudad Juarez on this border and in other parts of the border. And definitely in terms of stopping individuals coming over the Guatemala-Mexico border. You've heard about the asylum ban. The asylum ban, basically the Trump administration put into effect a policy that says that anyone who comes from another country outside of Mexico, so if folks are coming, for example, from Guatemala through Mexico, they have to apply for asylum in Mexico rather than the United States. Or similarly, if folks are coming from Honduras or El Salvador and they go through Guatemala or Mexico, then they have to make their asylum claims there. There's been some developments last week. You heard in the courts that that was challenged in the federal courts. We believe that that's illegal. Congress has already legislated that. But the federal courts basically allowed that policy to continue here in Texas and in Arizona and in New Mexico. On the California side, however, and in Arizona, there's been an injunction against that policy. So this is very strange. It's hard to remember anything similar to this, where the federal courts are going to allow a policy to be applied in one part of the border and not another part of the border. And that no doubt will affect the flows. It probably will move migration flows out towards the west, but we have yet to see how that policy will be applied here in Texas, in West Texas, and in southern New Mexico. It hasn't yet been implemented, but we expect that it will be. And then you've heard of family detention. Of course, this week, the Trump administration announced plans to expand family detention and basically indefinitely detain families for the length of their immigration cases while they're fighting their immigration cases in courts. This is very troubling from a human perspective. We know the psychosocial effects on children and families of family detention basically amount to torture. And so from a moral perspective, this is simply wrong. But we also believe that it's illegal as per the Flores Agreement. So this will immediately, probably in the very near future, go before the judge who presided over the Flores Agreement. And we're very hopeful that it will be declared illegal and it won't go into effect. But we need to continue to push our lawmakers on this just in case it does. So in terms of Remain in Mexico, an update on the numbers. Remain in Mexico is the policy whereby folks who are claiming asylum in the United States, many of them are returned to Mexico, to places like Ciudad Juarez, across from El Paso, and they're forced to navigate the immigration system on that side of the border. It's very troubling from our perspective because it limits folks' access to attorneys. It also puts them in conditions of, puts their safety and security into jeopardy. It's also created a long-term vulnerable population in Ciudad Juarez that has a lot of needs: education, jobs, work, healthcare, that unfortunately our sister cities in Mexico just do not have the ability, the infrastructure to provide for. So there's a lot of problems that come with this. Now let's look at the numbers in terms of where we are. As of today, about 32,000 folks have been sent back as a result of this policy back to Mexico. And here in Juarez, Ciudad Juarez alone, folks who have come to this part of the border, 13,000 of them have been sent back to Mexico. And then this is on top of the folks who are already on that list. So folks who have been impacted by this policy of metering or turnbacks, there are 5,600 migrants who are currently waiting on the list in Juarez. And then there are 26,000, we think, along the entire US-Mexico border. So we are creating effectively a vulnerable population of refugees in our sister cities on the other side of the border in Mexico, in communities that simply don't have the ability to provide for their needs. Now, very troubling for all the reasons that I've mentioned, but it's also troubling because it's also hard to keep track of these numbers because it's a very fluid population. Many of these people are simply unable to bear the consequences of what it means to spend many months, if not more than a year, fighting an asylum case in El Paso, where we have a very draconian court system that has a very low approval rate for asylum cases. And so many of them lose hope, they give up, and they're turning back, and they're going back to their home countries. We also have a situation here where the international agency, the IOM, is beginning to bus people back to their countries of origin. It's very troubling to us because there are some instances where we think that this might violate the principles of non-refoulement. So it's a very fluid situation right now in Ciudad Juarez. The numbers are very difficult to keep track of because it is so fluid, because people are coming and going, and because there simply isn't the infrastructure, the shelters to track these folks, to provide enough shelter for them, to have a good account for the population. It's simply a very difficult thing. And so for a number of different reasons, just a very troubling policy. And the population in Ciudad Juarez of migrants continues to grow. So those are some of the factors that are definitely contributing, in addition to the seasonal factors, to the reduction in folks who are coming, the 24% reduction in folks who are coming to the US-Mexico border. I also want to talk about something else. All of these different elements, and there are more, we don't have the time or the space to go into all the different things that the Trump administration is doing right now to deter migrants from coming to the US-Mexico border and to turn back asylum seekers. But effectively, what's happening with all these different policies, if you add them up, is the Trump administration is very successfully, unfortunately, just building a wall, whether it's a wall of policy, a virtual wall, collaborating with the US, with the Mexican government, with the deployment of troops. All these things effectively add up to a wall that the Trump administration is building with policies and different enforcement measures. The wall, the Trump administration is building that wall. It's happening right now under our watch, in our name, and with our tax resources. In addition to that, that virtual wall, the Trump administration continues to build a physical wall. This is a picture courtesy of our friends at the Coalition for Environmental Diversity. This is a picture of a physical wall that's being constructed just to the west of us in southern New Mexico. The Trump administration there in Doña Ana and Luna counties has begun the construction of 53 miles of wall, new wall and replacement wall in that area. 53 miles that add up to $789 million. So nearly $1 billion. And there are walls that are being constructed in other parts of the border right now as we speak, as well contracts that are being cut in the valley, for example, in South Texas. That is an enormous figure. I want to provide a little bit of context for what that figure means, but we expect that the Trump administration could allocate up to $2 billion this year for wall construction and wall replacement. 1 billion of that coming from a diversion from military funding, the military budget. A very significant amount of money. Compare that to, for the year for which we have the latest figures, $257 million in foreign aid to Guatemala. And you may have seen in the news that the Trump administration has been posturing to cut foreign aid. But $257 million, $780 million just for 53 miles of wall in one portion, 2 counties of New Mexico. You can see the gross disparity in funding. Really the mismatch in what we're doing as a country. If we really want to address immigration in any meaningful way, we need to address the drivers of migration in those countries. And right now, the foreign aid that we're providing to Guatemala is really a pittance for what the country needs in order to stem the flow of migration, in order to guarantee people's right not to migrate. Guatemala, just again to put in context what those figures means, one of the in rural communities, one of the crops that's very important to the livelihoods of many Guatemalans is coffee. And right now, coffee and the fact that there's a lot of coffee rust, the fact that there's a drought in Guatemala, different parts of Guatemala are undergoing a drought, macro factors of climate change. Also, the international market is exerting downward pressure on coffee prices. That's one of the factors, just one of the factors that's driving migration out of Guatemala to the United States. To put in fact, just to put those numbers in context, the 2018 Guatemalan coffee yield, in terms of economic numbers, that was $693 million of exports of coffee that came from Guatemala. That doesn't approach the cost for what it's going to, how much we're going to be spending on a wall just in this year. For what we're spending on that wall in Doña Ana and Luna County, $789 million. If we could double the take-home pay for every Guatemalan grower and picker, basically, if we just to put that number in context. Now, Guatemalans, though, in terms of remittances, again, to put that number in context, are providing, last year they provided $9.3 billion in remittances back to their communities. So the Guatemalans who are here are working to provide, to support their families, to support their communities, and are promoting economic development through the remittances at the tune of $9.3 billion. Again, it puts the numbers in perspective, and it also speaks to the fact that the great mismatch in the needs on the ground, both at the US-Mexico border and in these sending countries, and what the strategy of the US government really is, which is simply one of deterrence and not one of trying to address the drivers and the root causes of immigration. One thing, before we move on, one thing that I do want to pay attention to that we're beginning to see borne out in some of the CBP numbers, but also here in the local community, is that we're beginning to see a meaningful spike in the amount of asylum seekers who are coming from Mexico. And so folks have been concerned, of course, about folks who are coming from the Central American countries of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. We're also seeing a lot of migration from Africa coming into Ciudad Juárez. But there's also been a notable spike in asylum seekers who are coming from Mexico. And they too have been subject, although they're not supposed to be, to turn back policies. We've encountered people like that. Just a couple days ago here in this community, this is a picture of what happened, I think, on Friday night when a number of asylum seekers presented at the border, including Mexicans, and the border was shut down for some time. This coming from our photographer, friend on the ground, Luis Hernandez, a journalist who took this photo. So it's something that we're going to be continuing to pay attention to. It does look like there may be a growing number of Mexican asylum seekers in Ciudad Juárez, so we're going to pay attention to that, and we'll provide further updates in the future. What are some things that you can do right now? Some concrete measures, some concrete things that you can do. Bishop Seitz, who's the Roman Catholic Bishop of El Paso, has been doing tremendous work in standing up for migrants. He's participated in bringing asylum seekers over, presenting asylum seekers at the bridge who've been denied access to the asylum system. This is a picture of him doing that. He started a border refugee assistance fund to help the many asylum seekers who are weighted, who are stranded, who are trapped in Ciudad Juárez as a result of turnbacks and as a result of remain in Mexico. The border refugees, tens of thousands of dollars have already been dedicated to that fund, and that money is going to go directly to supporting the immediate humanitarian needs of people, of migrants who are trapped in Ciudad Juárez. So for their shelter, their food, their immediate humanitarian basic needs, that fund has been established. And so that's one thing that you can do. You can donate to that fund, and you can find the way to do that on our website, hopeborder.org. If you are from the region and perhaps you can't make a monetary donation, next week, one of our partners here in the community is going to be announcing ways that you can donate items directly that will go to shelters in Ciudad Juárez. We'll keep you updated. Pay attention to our social media when an announcement is made. There's been some difficulty in getting bulk items because of all the customs issues between the United States and Mexico into Juárez to support this population, but one of our partners has made it happen, and so we'll be announcing that next week, and where you can donate, the collection site that will be available here in El Paso for you to donate things like food, clothing, and shoes. Another thing that you can do is right now contact your legislators. Your legislators are probably back in district because it's August. They're going to be going back quickly, back to Washington, D.C. But if you can contact them now and let them know that you don't support things like Remain in Mexico, like the policy of turnbacks and metering, and like the proposed family detention policies of the Trump administration, you can let them know that now, and you can let them know those things while they're in your district. Next month, we're going to be looking at some significant budget battles, and we expect that the border enforcement agencies are going to be coming back to the table to look at ways of funding things like detention and deportation, and policies like Remain in Mexico and family detention. And so there's going to be a big fight around those things. We're going to need folks engaged across the country here and in this community on that. And so our next webinar next month, we'll delve into that and give you tools so that you can contact your legislator and push back on some of these dehumanizing anti-immigrant policies in terms of the budget process that Congress is going to be going through next month. So pay attention, that'll be our next webinar. Also, our partners at Clinic, the Catholic Legal Immigration Network, have just got on the ground here locally. And their job right now through a new and innovative project is to provide for the needs, the legal needs of asylum seekers who are waiting in Ciudad Juárez, those who have been affected by metering, Remain in Mexico. And so if you're a lawyer and you're on this webinar right now, or if you know a lawyer and you understand immigration law, you work in the field of immigration law, and you speak Spanish, or perhaps French or another language that might be useful to migrants here, you can contact Clinic right now at that website, cliniclegal.org/Estamos Unidos, to be able to volunteer to plug into this program. We need legal support. The migrants here, less than 1% of migrants who have been impacted by remaining in Mexico have access to attorneys. It's imperative that we get them legal support. And so if you know anyone who can plug into this, please do so, and please let them know. And then finally, our annual teach-in. We're having our annual teach-in this year in October over Indigenous Peoples Day weekend, October 11th to the 13th. And you can plug into this. There'll be workshops, there'll be keynote presentations, there'll be opportunities for coalition building and alliance building. And this year we're partnering with the Latinx Catholic Leadership Coalition. We're hosting them. They'll be with us here in El Paso for this teach-in and public action. So stay tuned for more details. Check out our website, hopeborder.org. We'll publish more details as they become available, ways for you to plug in, and registration opportunities at for the Jornada por la Justicia on October 11th through the 13th. And I think that brings us to the end of the presentation. So if we have any questions, we can go into those right now. So we've got a question from I'll read it to you. I believe that a long-term solution to have voter turnout to ensure that pro-immigrant rights politicians are elected. I'm a deputy voter registrar, and I'm offering my time to get people registered to vote at your next public meeting or presentation. Great, that's really important. The key to fighting back against these anti-immigrant policies, these policies of dehumanization of migrants in targeted communities is going to be fought. That battle is going to be fought at the ballot box, and so it's important for people to register to vote, and to get other people registered to vote. So thank you, Mr. Avila, for that.
Right, remind them that you can ask questions through the chat or through the queue.
And you can ask questions through the chat option or through the Q&A box. And I think that's it. Okay, well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure being with you all. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. We'll be back to you with more opportunities for webinars next month. Our webinar will be about the appropriations battle and fighting for immigrant justice through that. So thank you very much, and we'll be back in touch.